The plastic zip tie snapped shut around Isaiah's neck with a sharp click. The cabin was still. The air felt thick. Not a single person moved. Not a single voice rose above the low hum of the plane. The only sound was the faint buzz of the overhead lights and the distant, steady rhythm of the engines. A 12-year-old boy stood frozen beside seat 7A, eyes wide with confusion, hands trembling at his sides as the zip tie tightened lightly around his throat. His gaze shifted frantically, searching the sea of the passengers for help, but none came, not even a whisper of dissent from the other travelers. The flight attendant, a man with a crisp uniform and a blank, almost rehearsed expression, stood there, his fingers steady as they adjusted the plastic restraint. "Protocol," the attendant muttered under his breath, his voice flat, betraying no hint of emotion. The words didn't seem to land in the cabin. No one challenged him, no one spoke up. It was as if the whole moment existed in a vacuum, suspended between what should have been right and what was actually happening. Isaiah's heart hammered in his chest as the zip tie clicked shut, and he stood there, motionless, unable to grasp what was happening to him. His father had walked him to the gate. He had checked his boarding pass 3 times. There had been no sign of trouble, no reason for suspicion, no signs of anything wrong. Yet here he was, bound in front of dozens of passengers, each of them pretending to look the other way, either too afraid or too indifferent to speak up. Isaiah's gaze finally landed on the attendant again, his lips trembling as he whispered, "What's going on? Why are you doing this?" But the attendant said nothing, only looked down at him with a calculating, almost dismissive gaze, his face unreadable as he stepped back slightly. The moment lingered, thick and oppressive, like the weight of something unspeakable was hanging in the air. From his place at the front of the plane, Isaiah could feel the eyes of the other passengers. Some curious, some uncertain, some even sympathetic, but all were silent, as if afraid to intervene. They had all seen it. A young boy, alone, targeted by an adult with an air of authority. It should have been over by now. Someone should have said something, intervened, but no one did. Then the silence was shattered by a new presence. Heavy boots thudded against the floor of the cabin. The shadow that filled the doorway wasn't just a man. It was a force, radiating power and control. A figure stepped into the aisle, eyes sharp and cold. His voice was low, but it carried the weight of a thunderstorm ready to break. "Where is my son?" The words were a command, not a question. It was a father searching for his child, but not just any father. This was someone who wasn't used to being ignored. This was someone trained to dismantle threats. And today, the threat wasn't something or someone else. It was the man standing before the flight attendant. Isaiah's breath caught in his throat, his wide eyes locking on the figure in the doorway. His heart stuttered. It was him. His father, Malik Thompson. Malik Thompson. The man who had taught Isaiah to stand strong, to hold his head high no matter the circumstance. The man whose eyes now scanned the cabin with precision, taking in everything in an instant. The flight attendant's posture, the zip tie still loosely hanging from his son's neck, the stiff, tense atmosphere in the air. "Where is my son?" Malik's voice came again, even lower this time, more deliberate. The flight attendant, who had been so sure of himself moments ago, seemed to shrink under the weight of Malik's gaze. He fumbled for words, but none came. His hands twitched nervously at his side, and for the first time he seemed uncertain, his earlier authority slipping like sand through his fingers. The cabin was still as Malik took a single step forward, and the sound of his boots against the floor was the only thing that could be heard above the stunned silence. Passengers shifted uneasily in their seats, some instinctively clutching their armrests, others pretending to focus on the safety information card in their laps, as if trying to look busy. "Look anywhere but at what was unfolding. Brooks," Malik said sharply, his eyes narrowing on the flight attendant who was now visibly sweating. "You have a very serious explanation to make." Brooks, the flight attendant, didn't know how to respond. His posture stiffened, but the words caught in his throat. He had no defense, not now, not against the calm, controlled fury in Malik's eyes. I followed protocol," he stammered, trying to piece together a justification that had no real weight behind it. He was acting suspicious, and we have to—" "No," Malik interrupted him, his voice cold and final. "You don't get to explain this. Not like this." He took another step forward, his presence now a force that no one could ignore. "You don't get to make my son feel like a criminal for simply existing." Isaiah stood there, frozen, his heart still pounding in his chest. His father had arrived, but in a way that felt almost too late. Too many moments had passed. Too many eyes had watched him be humiliated, stripped of his dignity. But now, with Malik standing before him, everything shifted. A sense of safety, of power, of belonging, slowly began to seep into Isaiah's bones. The weight on his chest started to lift. "Now, you're going to explain yourself," Malik said, his voice as steady as a rock, but with a quiet intensity that made everyone else in the cabin hold their breath. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The tension in the air hung like a storm cloud, pregnant with the promise of change, the promise of justice. Brooks, the flight attendant, swallowed hard, his hands shaking slightly as he fumbled with the plastic zip tie, trying to undo the restraint that had never had any place on a child's neck. Malik wasn't about to let him off that easy. He stepped closer, towering over the man. "You don't get to hide behind protocol when you treat children like criminals," he said. The words cut through the cabin like a sharp blade, silencing the whispers of the passengers, who were now watching in rapt attention. Finally, the flight attendant began to move, but not fast enough. Malik's gaze never wavered, his presence still commanding, still unwavering. The moment was thick, fraught with tension and uncertainty, but as the seconds dragged on, something shifted. A quiet understanding passed between Malik and Isaiah, an understanding that, despite the injustice they had faced, they had one another. And with Malik standing in the aisle, ready to fight for what was right, the quiet storm that had gathered in the cabin was finally about to break. The stillness in the cabin was broken by the hum of the overhead lights, a mechanical sound that felt out of place against the tension in the air. Malik's eyes remained fixed on Brooks, the flight attendant who had just made the mistake of a lifetime. He was still fumbling with the zip tie as though unsure whether to remove it or leave it in place. His nervous movements made it clear. The confidence he'd shown earlier had completely evaporated, replaced by a growing sense of dread. Isaiah's chest tightened as his father's presence seemed to fill the cabin. There was an odd sense of safety now, but the heaviness of the moment still weighed on him. His hands were still trembling, the zip tie pulling ever so slightly around his neck, and it felt like an unspoken accusation hanging between him and everyone in the cabin. But Malik's arrival had shifted something inside him, a sense of resolve, a promise of protection. His father was here, and nothing would happen to him now. "You should have thought about this before," Malik continued, his voice cutting through the silence, low but strong. "You should have thought about who you're dealing with before you decided to treat my son like this." Brooks, still stiff with fear, glanced at the surrounding passengers, his eyes darting back and forth as if seeking some sort of escape. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of nervous clearing throats, the creaking of seatbelts, and the occasional cough. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if the entire plane had collectively decided to wait for the next move. Malik stood there, his presence overwhelming, not saying a word. Just standing, a steady force in the middle of the aisle, and every eye in the cabin was on him. And then, without another word, he gently but firmly reached out and lifted the zip tie from around Isaiah's neck. The moment the restraint was removed, Isaiah exhaled, his body finally releasing the tension that had built up during the last few minutes. He didn't realize just how much pressure he'd been holding in until it was gone. His father's hand on his shoulder was a reminder that the fear and uncertainty that had gripped him only moments ago could now be left behind. Malik turned to Isaiah, his eyes softening, and for a brief moment, the world outside of the cabin disappeared. He placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity, of strength. "It's okay, soldier. You're with me now." Isaiah looked up at him, his eyes still wide but no longer filled with the same fear. A sense of calm slowly washed over him, though it was accompanied by the quiet realization that what had just happened, what he had just experienced, was no small thing. He had been humiliated in front of strangers, treated like a criminal when all he wanted was to visit his cousin, to take a trip his father had promised. And now, even with his father standing before him, the injustice of it all burned in his chest. But in the moment, he allowed himself to breathe. He allowed himself to trust that his father was here and that things were about to change. "What's your name?" Malik asked, his voice still low, but now with a cold, calculated edge that spoke of everything he had seen, everything he had endured over the years, everything he had been prepared for. He didn't need to raise his voice to command attention. Brooks stood there, eyes wide, sweat now beading on his forehead. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His throat seemed to close, as though his body knew what was coming next. The fight had been taken from him in an instant. "Answer me," Malik said again, the words slicing through the cabin. "What's your name?" "Brooks," the flight attendant finally stammered, his voice breaking slightly. "Kevin Brooks." Malik didn't flinch. He didn't take his eyes off the man. He was calm, but beneath the surface, the storm of justice was beginning to form. "Kevin Brooks," Malik repeated as though committing the name to memory. "You're going to explain to me why you thought it was okay to treat my son like this. You're going to explain why you decided that a child, an unaccompanied minor, no less, was a threat." Brooks, trying to regain some sense of control, shifted uncomfortably, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. He opened his mouth again, but the words seemed to falter. I followed protocol," he said almost desperately. He was acting suspicious. "You know, it's the rules. We have to follow the procedures." Malik's expression didn't change. "No, Kevin. That's not what you did." He took a step closer to the flight attendant, his voice now colder. "You targeted my son. You profiled him. And now you're trying to justify it by hiding behind some imaginary rule book." The truth in Malik's words hit like a physical blow, and for the first time, Kevin Brooks seemed to shrink under the weight of his actions. The cabin was still. No one dared speak. No one dared breathe too loudly. Even the flight attendants standing nervously behind the galley knew what was happening. They had all seen it, the way Kevin had treated Isaiah, the way the boy had been humiliated for no reason other than the fact that he was alone, young and different. For a moment it seemed as though the entire plane was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the tension, for someone to do something. Anything. But it was Malik who broke the silence. He turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across the cabin as he addressed the passengers for the first time. "I know you're all watching this," Malik said, his voice clear and sharp. "I know you've seen what just happened. And I want you to remember this moment. Because it's not just about my son. It's about all of us. It's about how we treat each other when no one is looking. How we stand up against injustice, even when it's uncomfortable." A few passengers shifted in their seats, their eyes darting between Malik and the flight attendant. There was a ripple of something, recognition perhaps, or guilt. Some seemed uncomfortable, others looked away, but none of them intervened. Malik continued, his gaze locked on Brooks. "You don't get to hide behind policy. Kevin, you don't get to use a piece of paper to justify treating a child like he's guilty of something he hasn't even done." Brooks opened his mouth to speak again, but his words fell flat. He could only stand there, a hollow man in a uniform, caught in the web of his own making. Malik turned back to Isaiah, his hand gently resting on his son's shoulder, offering a sense of calm, a sense of resolution. "We're going to fix this, son. I promise you." Malik glanced up once more, his eyes meeting the flight attendants. "And you, Brooks," he said, his voice low, "you're going to learn what real accountability means. Because this is just the beginning." With that, Malik turned, his presence as commanding as ever. He walked slowly down the aisle, his eyes never leaving the trembling flight attendant. Every step was deliberate, every step a promise to see this through. The injustice that had been done was not over. It was just starting. Isaiah stood a little straighter now, his eyes still wide but filled with something else, something stronger. He knew his father was right. This moment wasn't just about him. It was about standing up for what was right, for justice, and for making sure this never happened again. And as Malik reached the front of the cabin, he knew the battle was far from over. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like they were on the right side of it. The plane's hum echoed through the cabin, a mechanical sound that was almost soothing. But inside, everything had shifted. The tension from earlier, the oppressive silence, now hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. As Malik took his seat once more, the eyes of the passengers lingered, some still wide with shock. others unsure whether they had just witnessed a breaking point or an unresolved conflict that would soon fade away. Malik sat with his back straight, his eyes locked on the seatbelt sign above as the plane began its ascent. Isaiah sat beside him, still shaken but visibly trying to compose himself. The feeling of the zip tie being removed still lingered, though the physical discomfort had faded. What remained was the raw, unsettling awareness of how quickly a child could be made to feel small, helpless, and criminal simply because he was alone, simply because of how he looked. Malik glanced over at his son, offering a faint smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You good?" he asked softly, his voice a steady anchor in the chaotic sea of emotions swirling between them. Isaiah nodded slowly, his eyes still a little glassy, but his expression was more resolute. "I'm okay," he whispered, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. He hadn't realized how deeply he'd been affected by the incident until now. It wasn't just the zip tie. It wasn't just the way people had watched in silence. It was the feeling of being misunderstood, of being perceived as something he wasn't, a threat. Malik reached over, placing a hand on Isaiah's shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "We'll make sure it doesn't happen again," he promised, his voice low but with a quiet certainty. He knew that wasn't just a promise to his son, but to everyone who had witnessed the injustice. Malik's gaze flickered briefly toward the flight attendants in the galley, their eyes carefully averted, not meeting his stare. They knew the story wasn't over, that the confrontation wasn't just about a misunderstanding. It was about power, about systems in place that allowed this kind of treatment to go unchecked, and it was about accountability, something none of them had expected to face today. The moment in the aisle wasn't just a confrontation with one man, Brooks. It was a confrontation with the very system that allowed Brooks's behavior to go unnoticed, unchallenged for so long. In the silence that followed, a voice broke through the murmur of passengers settling into their seats. A man near the back of the plane, an older gentleman with a salt-and-pepper beard, leaned forward and caught Malik's eye. "I'm sorry about what happened to your boy," the man said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I saw what he did. It wasn't right." Malik's eyes met the man's, and for a moment the weight of the words hung heavy between them. There was nothing that could undo what had happened to Isaiah, no apology that could erase the shame and humiliation. But here, in this moment, there was recognition. The man wasn't just offering an apology for what had been done to Isaiah. He was acknowledging something larger, the systems that allowed this to happen and the silence that had enabled it. "I appreciate that," Malik said, his voice soft but carrying the weight of experience. "But it's not enough. This can't be the end of it. Not for my son, not for anyone else." The older man nodded, his eyes deep with understanding. "I know," he replied quietly. "This has to change. It's been happening for too long." The words were simple, but they cut to the heart of the matter. This wasn't an isolated incident. It wasn't just about one boy and one flight attendant. It was about a much larger issue that had been festering under the surface for far too long. The discrimination, the profiling, the way some people were made to feel less than human simply because they didn't fit a certain mold. And in this moment, Malik knew it wasn't just about standing up for Isaiah anymore. It was about standing up for all the children, for all the people who had been treated unfairly, who had been dismissed, who had been made to feel invisible or guilty without cause. Malik leaned back in his seat, his gaze sweeping over the cabin. His mind was already working, calculating, analyzing what had just happened, and what needed to happen next. He could feel the ripple of what he had started. A conversation had been ignited, whether the passengers knew it or not, whether they wanted to engage in it or not. The truth was out now. There was no turning back. Isaiah, still gripping the edge of his seat, turned to look at his father. The same unease in his eyes, but a faint trace of something else too. Hope. He knew, even at 12, that things didn't just change overnight. He had learned that from his father. But now he felt like part of something bigger, a conversation, a fight for something greater than just him. "I didn't do anything wrong," Isaiah said quietly, almost as if he were convincing himself as much as he was saying it to his father. "I know, son," Malik replied gently, "but sometimes the world doesn't see that. They don't see the truth. And that's where we come in." Isaiah nodded, understanding in his heart that his father was right. The world had a way of seeing things that wasn't always fair, wasn't always right. But his father had taught him how to see beyond that, to recognize the injustice and to stand up against it. This moment would not define him. It would fuel him. It would fuel them both. Malik turned his attention back to the front of the plane, where the captain stood in the cockpit, glancing nervously toward the rear of the cabin. Malik's eyes narrowed slightly, his thoughts turning to what had just transpired. He could feel the captain's uncertainty, could sense the shift in the dynamic. The flight attendant's actions had been unacceptable, but the captain, too, had a responsibility to ensure that nothing like this ever happened again. Malik's thoughts turned to the broader implications. What would happen when they landed? When the plane touched down, what kind of justice would follow? Would there be accountability for Brooks? Would the airline take responsibility for their employees' actions? The flight crew had already failed them. The passengers had failed them. And now it was up to Malik to ensure that everyone who had seen what had happened and ignored it would have to reckon with it. He wasn't going to let it slide. Not for his son. Not for any other child who had ever been made to feel less than. The plane continued to climb, the engines humming steadily beneath them. But Malik's mind was already working in overdrive. There were phone calls to make, people to speak to, and a plan to put into motion. This wasn't just about the incident on the plane. This was about dismantling a culture of silence and indifference, about holding people accountable for their actions, about making sure that no one, especially a child, would ever have to face something like this again. As the flight settled into its cruising altitude, the overhead lights dimmed slightly and passengers began to settle into their journey. Some closed their eyes, others read their books, but the atmosphere in the cabin had changed. It was no longer just a flight. It was a moment of reckoning. Malik glanced at Isaiah again, his heart heavy with the weight of what his son had just experienced. But there was pride there, too. Pride in the way Isaiah had handled the situation. Pride in the way he was standing tall, even in the face of something so unfair. "You're going to make a difference, son," Malik said quietly, his voice full of conviction. "You already have." Isaiah looked up at him, the smallest hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "I want to help change things," he whispered. "I want to help make sure no one else feels like this." Malik's chest tightened with pride, the words carrying more weight than they had in any other moment. His son was ready to stand up for justice, ready to fight for what was right. And that, Malik thought, was the greatest gift he could ever give him. As the plane cruised toward its destination, Malik's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. The oppressive silence that had hung in the cabin moments ago had now dissipated, but the weight of what had transpired lingered in the air. Every conversation had been stifled, every thought swallowed by the presence of the conflict that had unfolded between flight attendant Kevin Brooks and his son. Yet the air had shifted. A new undercurrent of awareness pulsed through the cabin. Isaiah sat beside his father, his eyes fixed on the window, though his thoughts seemed miles away. His small fingers gripped the armrest with a tension that matched his father's, though he tried to keep still, as though maintaining control over the storm of emotions brewing inside. Malik understood. His son had been through something no child should ever have to endure, and yet there they were, together on this flight, with no clear resolution. The passengers, many of whom had witnessed the injustice, now seemed to be silently reflecting on their own role in the events. A few exchanged glances, others stared straight ahead, pretending that what had just happened was an isolated incident, something that could be forgotten once they disembarked. But for Malik, and for Isaiah, this wasn't something that could just fade away. This was a marker, a turning point in a long battle that stretched far beyond this single flight. The hum of the engines was rhythmic, almost hypnotic, but to Malik, it felt like the beat of something deeper. It was the pulse of a world that still hadn't learned to reckon with its own prejudices. A world that still didn't fully understand the damage caused by assuming guilt based on appearance alone. It wasn't just about the zip tie. It wasn't just about one flight attendant and one flight. It was about something bigger, something systemic. Malik shifted in his seat, leaning toward his son. "Isaiah," he said softly, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. "You've seen it now. You've felt it. This is the reality that many people, especially people of color, face every day. They're judged before they even speak, before they even have a chance to show who they really are." Isaiah nodded, but there was still confusion in his eyes. "But why, Dad? Why do people think like that? Why do they treat me like I did something wrong?" Malik let out a slow breath, his eyes turning toward the window, his mind searching for the right words. "Because fear, son," he said softly. "Fear of the unknown, fear of what doesn't look familiar. People are scared of what they don't understand, and instead of trying to learn or challenge their own biases, they make assumptions. It's easier that way. But it's not right." Isaiah looked out the window, his reflection merging with the sky outside, his expression pensive. "So, I'm just supposed to take it?" His voice wavered slightly as he spoke the words. "No," Malik said firmly. "You're not supposed to take it. And I'm not going to let you. You're going to fight back. Not with anger, not with violence, but with the truth. And the truth is that no one has the right to treat you, or anyone else, as less than." The words hung in the air between them, filled with the kind of understanding that could only come from a father who had seen too much of the world's ugliness and a son who was only beginning to grasp it. Malik's gaze softened as he looked at Isaiah, his chest swelling with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Pride for the boy his son was becoming, and sorrow for the world that would force him to face such realities so soon. "Things aren't fair," Malik continued, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper. "But we don't let that stop us. We push back. We make them listen. And we do it the right way. You, me, and everyone who believes in what's right." Isaiah looked at his father, his eyes wide, absorbing every word. The storm of emotions inside him wasn't quite gone, but he felt something shift. Something solid. Something that felt like strength. The announcement that the plane was beginning its descent broke the heavy silence that had settled between them. Passengers began to stir, gathering their things and preparing for landing, but the quiet intensity remained. Malik glanced at the overhead compartment where the seatbelt sign flickered on. It felt like a small signal of the end of their journey, but it wasn't the end of this moment. Not by a long shot. As the plane touched down on the runway, the familiar sounds of the landing gears, the gentle bump as they made contact with the tarmac, felt almost surreal to Malik. This was supposed to be a routine flight, a simple journey to visit family. But what had happened in the moments before had fundamentally altered the course of that day. And, Malik suspected, the course of his son's life. The plane taxied toward the gate, and passengers began to rise from their seats, gathering their bags and preparing to disembark. Malik sat still, his mind turning over everything that had happened, everything that still needed to happen. He glanced down at Isaiah, who was sitting quietly beside him, his fingers tapping nervously on the armrest, eyes focused ahead. "Ready?" Malik asked, offering a small smile. Isaiah took a deep breath, his small chest rising and falling with a newfound calm. "Yeah, let's go." As they stood and made their way down the aisle, the weight of the situation still lingered in the air. But there was something else, too, an unspoken promise. No matter what happened next, Malik and Isaiah were in this together, and they were ready to face whatever came their way. Once they exited the plane and entered the terminal, the scene was a stark contrast to the tension they had left behind on the aircraft. The usual hum of a busy airport filled the air. People chatting, luggage rolling, announcements echoing over the loudspeaker. But for Malik, it felt different. There was a sense of anticipation in the air. He knew that something was about to change, something bigger than this one incident. His phone buzzed in his pocket as they walked through the gate. A message from Devin Ward flashed on the screen. "We need to talk. I've made some calls. We're escalating this." Malik paused for a moment, glancing at Isaiah, who was looking around the terminal, clearly still processing the whirlwind of the past hours. "Hold on for a sec, son," Malik said, pulling his phone from his pocket and quickly tapping out a response. "I'm here. Meet me in the security office. Let's make this right." He slipped the phone back into his pocket and turned to Isaiah. "Come on," he said, putting a hand gently on his son's back. "Let's get this done." They walked through the terminal, heading toward the security office. Malik was no stranger to making tough calls. He had been in situations before where he had to face the unthinkable, confront those in power, challenge injustice head-on. But this was different. This wasn't about war zones or foreign lands. This was about his son. This was about making sure no other child would ever have to endure what Isaiah had experienced. As they entered the security office, Malik's eyes immediately found the familiar face of Devin Ward, standing next to a couple of other officials, all of them holding files and documents. Without a word, Malik walked straight up to them, his gaze steely, unwavering. "Let's get to work," Malik said. The meeting in the security office was brief but intense. Devin and his team laid out what they had so far: witness statements, video footage, and flight manifests. They had already gathered enough evidence to take action, but Malik knew this was only the beginning. There were still systems to dismantle, policies to challenge, and a culture of indifference to confront. The conversation moved quickly. Devin had already contacted Bright Ray Airlines' legal team, demanding an immediate review of their policies regarding unaccompanied minors. The investigation into Brooks's actions had begun, but Malik knew that wasn't enough. This wasn't just about one employee. This was about an entire system that allowed discrimination to be hidden under the guise of safety. "We'll get him," Malik said, his voice sharp with conviction. "But we need to hit them where it hurts. Policies, training, accountability. This doesn't stop at one man." Devin nodded, his face serious. "I agree. We've already started pushing for a full audit of their entire boarding process. This isn't just about Bright Ray anymore. This is about making sure this doesn't happen again, anywhere." Malik glanced at Isaiah, who had been silently listening, his small hand clenched around his father's. The boy was processing everything, absorbing the weight of what was happening, but there was a glint of determination in his eyes now. "Thank you," Isaiah whispered, his voice barely audible, but Malik heard it. "For what?" Malik asked, his tone soft. "For being here," Isaiah said, his voice steady now. "For making sure it doesn't happen again." Malik smiled, his chest swelling with pride. "Always, son, always." And with that, they turned together, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that the fight for justice wasn't just about them. It was about creating a world where no one ever had to feel the way Isaiah had felt, where the silent cruelty of discrimination would finally be challenged. The airport terminal felt oddly quiet as Malik and Isaiah made their way toward the exit, their footsteps echoing in the vast, open space. The weight of the day still hung heavily over them, but there was something else now. It wasn't just about what had happened on the plane anymore. Something had shifted in the atmosphere, and it was as if every step they took was a small ripple, growing larger and larger. Malik glanced down at Isaiah, who was walking just slightly ahead, his small shoulders squared with the kind of quiet determination that only a child who had been through something so unsettling could understand. He knew that his son was still processing everything, still trying to make sense of it all. But he also knew that what had begun as an individual moment, a personal confrontation, had already started to snowball. This was bigger than just the two of them. It had become a statement, a declaration that silence, indifference, and discrimination wouldn't be tolerated anymore. Malik couldn't help but think of the conversations that had unfolded over the past several hours, from the tense confrontation in the cabin to the quiet discussions with Devin and his team in the security office. The messages had been clear, but they had only scratched the surface. The work that needed to be done was monumental, but Malik was prepared for it. They had to hit harder than just one incident. It wasn't about fixing a single broken system. It was about dismantling a culture that had allowed systems like that to exist for so long. They reached the parking lot, and Malik slid into the front seat of their rental car. Isaiah climbed into the passenger side, his face a mix of exhaustion and something else, something that Malik recognized but couldn't quite name. His son had stepped into a world that was different from what he had known, a world where people weren't always kind, where authority figures weren't always right. "How are you doing?" Malik asked as he pulled out of the parking lot, the steady hum of the car's engine filling the space between them. Isaiah shifted in his seat, looking out the window for a moment before answering. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I still don't really understand everything. But I'm starting to." Malik nodded, his gaze focused on the road ahead, but his thoughts were elsewhere. "You don't have to understand it all right now, son," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You just need to know that we're doing something about it. And we're not stopping. We're going to make sure this changes. Not just for you, but for everyone else who's ever been treated this way." Isaiah turned to look at him, his brow furrowed with the question that Malik had expected. "How do we do that, Dad? How do we make it stop?" Malik's grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly. The weight of his son's question was not lost on him. It was the same question that had driven him in the military, in his work with various agencies, and now it was the question that would drive him in this fight. "It starts with us, son," Malik said. "It starts with speaking up. It starts with people like you and me refusing to let things slide, refusing to be quiet when something isn't right. And then we get others to do the same. We make sure everyone sees the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it is." Isaiah's eyes softened as he considered his father's words. "You really think we can change things?" Malik glanced over at him, offering a small, reassuring smile. "I know we can." As the car made its way toward their destination, Malik's phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a text from Devon. It was a news alert. He glanced down, his fingers tightening slightly around the wheel as he read the headline. "Flight 442, unaccompanied minor, forced to wear restraints, flight attendant under investigation." Malik's stomach tightened, but he didn't let it show. This was only the beginning. This was the kind of exposure they needed. He opened the article and scanned it quickly. The details of the incident were there, albeit in sanitized language, only touching the surface of what had truly happened. But the headline was enough. It had already sparked interest, and that, Malik knew, was the first step. He tapped out a quick message to Devon. "This is just the start. We need to push harder." As he hit send, he felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. The spotlight was on them now. It wasn't just about Isaiah anymore. It was about making sure no one else was ever subjected to what he had witnessed today. Malik knew how quickly public opinion could shift. He knew how easy it was for stories like these to fade into the background, for the attention to shift to something else. But he wasn't going to let that happen. Not this time. Isaiah looked over at him again, sensing the change in his father's demeanor. "What's going to happen next?" he asked, his voice soft. Malik paused for a moment, considering how to answer. "A lot of things," he said finally. "There are going to be some hard conversations. People are going to have to answer for what happened. But we're going to make sure that change happens. This isn't over, son." Isaiah nodded, looking out the window again, though his thoughts seemed far away. "I don't think it'll ever be the same for me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Malik glanced over at him, his heart heavy. "No, it won't be. But that's not a bad thing. You're going to see the world differently now. You're going to see it for what it really is. And when you do, you'll be ready to fight for the truth. You'll be ready to make a difference." Isaiah was silent for a moment, processing his father's words. Then he turned back to him, his voice steady. "I'm ready," Malik smiled, his heart swelling with pride. He had always known his son was strong, but today had shown him a strength Malik had never expected to see so soon. His son was already stepping into the world as someone who would fight for justice, not just for himself, but for everyone else who had been wronged. The drive to their hotel was quiet, but in that silence, Malik's mind was racing. He knew that the next few days would be critical. The airline would try to downplay the situation. The media would shift their focus to other stories. There would be pushback, attempts to bury the truth, but Malik wasn't going to let that happen. When they arrived at the hotel, Malik immediately went to work. He called Devon, and together they began laying out the next steps. The media was on their side now, but it would take more than a few articles to make real change. Malik knew they needed more evidence, more voices, more support. He also reached out to activists, lawyers, and advocates who had been working on similar cases. Malik was no stranger to the world of activism, but this time, it was personal. This time, he wasn't just fighting for a cause, he was fighting for his son. And he wasn't going to stop until the systems that allowed injustice to thrive were dismantled piece by piece. By the time they sat down for dinner that evening, the news had spread. Social media was buzzing with hashtags, people sharing their outrage and support. The hashtag Justice for Isaiah had started trending. Celebrities, influencers, and activists alike began speaking out. The story had hit a nerve, not just because of what had happened to one child, but because so many people recognized themselves in Isaiah's story. It wasn't just about one boy. It was about a culture of discrimination that affected so many, children and adults alike. Malik sat across from Isaiah, his son quietly picking at his food, his eyes still occasionally drifting to the news updates on his phone. They were both exhausted, physically and emotionally, but Malik could see the fire in his son's eyes. They were no longer just victims of a system. They were now part of a growing movement that was going to change everything. "Looks like things are picking up," Malik said, glancing at the phone screen. "The world's starting to notice." Isaiah nodded, a small but powerful smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, and we're just getting started." The days following the incident aboard Flight 442 moved faster than Malik had anticipated. What had started as a single, isolated moment of injustice had snowballed into a full-blown media storm. Justice for Isaiah was everywhere. On Twitter, Instagram, even making its way to news networks. What had been a viral hashtag had quickly turned into a movement. One that spread across the country and ignited conversations about race, profiling, and the treatment of unaccompanied minors in the air travel system. Malik's phone buzzed relentlessly with calls, messages, and media requests. It was the kind of attention he had never sought but was now grappling with, knowing this was his chance to do something big. But even as the story continued to gain momentum, Malik remained grounded, focused. This was no longer just about an airline's failure to protect a child. It was about a much deeper issue. It was about ensuring that no one else, no child, no person, was ever treated with the same cruelty that had been inflicted on Isaiah. As the media frenzy grew, Malik and his team continued to work behind the scenes. Devin Ward, his trusted ally, had been invaluable in helping orchestrate the next steps. They had been in constant contact, pushing for a full investigation into the practices at Bright Ray Airlines. The company had released a vague statement condemning the actions of the flight attendant, but had yet to take responsibility for the broader issues within their system. Malik wasn't content to let that slide. In the midst of all this, there were the quiet moments. Moments that weren't captured on camera or written about in headlines. Moments like when Malik sat with Isaiah late at night in their hotel room, both of them reflecting on the days that had passed. The gravity of what had happened was still settling over them, but Malik could see the change in his son. He could see the resilience growing in him, the quiet strength that would stay with him long after this fight was over. Isaiah had been quieter than usual, but Malik knew he was processing. It wasn't just the trauma of what had happened. It was the weight of the responsibility that was now on his shoulders. His father's words had made it clear. Isaiah was part of something bigger now, something that could and would change the world. One morning, as Malik sat in the hotel's conference room with his team, a call came through. It was from the lawyer representing Bright Ray Airlines. Malik sat up straighter, the weight of the moment sinking in. He had been expecting this call for days now, but the reality of it still hit him with a sharpness. "Malik Thompson," the voice on the other end began, "I'm here to discuss a possible settlement for the incident involving your son, Isaiah." Malik's jaw tightened. He had been bracing for a negotiation, but not this kind. Not yet. They hadn't even begun to fight for real justice. The last thing he wanted was for Bright Ray Airlines to brush this under the rug with a quick payout. "I'm not interested in a settlement," Malik replied firmly. "This isn't about money. This is about accountability. This is about making sure what happened to my son never happens again." The lawyer on the other end hesitated. "I understand your position, Mr. Thompson, but Bright Ray is trying to resolve this quickly to avoid any further media backlash. We're prepared to offer compensation for your son's distress and an apology." "An apology?" Malik cut him off, his voice cold. "That's not enough. It's never been enough. This isn't just about one flight attendant's mistake. This is about how the system failed my son, how it continues to fail children who look like him. An apology won't fix that." The lawyer was silent for a moment. Malik could almost hear him trying to formulate a response, but Malik knew he wasn't going to let this conversation go the way they hoped. He had the momentum now, and he wasn't about to let it slip. "We're pushing for systemic change," Malik continued. "I want this to be about more than just one individual. I want a full audit of your policies, a reevaluation of your training, and public accountability for everyone involved in profiling my son. If you want to make this right, that's where you start. Not with some check and a few empty words." The line was quiet for a long time, But finally, the lawyer spoke, a note of reluctant understanding in his voice. "I'll relay your position to the higher-ups, Mr. Thompson, but we can't guarantee what they'll say." Malik hung up the phone without another word, a mix of frustration and resolve settling over him. This wasn't just going to be a quick fix. It wasn't going to be easy, but he was prepared for it. That afternoon, Malik and Isaiah were scheduled to speak at a press conference. It was a pivotal moment, one where the eyes of the media and the world would be on them. It was one thing to speak privately or behind closed doors. It was another to stand in front of cameras, to be the face of change. Isaiah was nervous. Malik could see it in the way his son fidgeted with the collar of his shirt, the way his fingers twitched at the edges of his sleeves. He had spoken about this moment before, but now that it was real, now that it was happening, the weight of the situation had settled on him. "You don't have to do this. You know," Malik said, his voice low, calm, as he placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "If you're not ready, we can wait." But Isaiah looked up at him, his eyes steady, no longer filled with doubt. "I want to do this, Dad," he said. "I want to make sure no one else has to go through what I did." Malik smiled softly, his heart swelling with pride. "You're stronger than you know." As they stepped onto the stage, the flashing lights of cameras were almost blinding. The room was packed with journalists, their questions already ready, their voices sharp and eager to capture every moment. Malik stood tall beside Isaiah, but it was his son who would be speaking first. The microphones were adjusted to their height, and Isaiah cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the crowd. For a moment, it seemed like the world had quieted down, just for him, just for this moment. Then he spoke. "I was treated like a threat," Isaiah began, his voice small at first, but growing with each word. "I was just sitting in my seat. I wasn't doing anything wrong, but someone decided I was a problem. I didn't even get a chance to explain. They just assumed I was dangerous because I was alone, and because of how I looked." His words were soft, but filled with weight. And then, with his father standing beside him, he continued, his voice growing stronger. "But it wasn't just me. This happens to kids every day, to people who look like me, and it needs to stop. It's not enough to say sorry. It's not enough to pretend it's an accident. We need real change. We need to make sure that no one, no child, no person is treated like I was. Not just because of their age. Not just because they're alone. Not just because of the color of their skin." The room was still. The journalists, the onlookers, the officials in the back, they were all listening. For the first time, the truth was out in the open, raw and unfiltered. It wasn't just a story. It was a call to action. Malik stood beside his son, his heart swelling with pride. This was the beginning of real change. They had started a conversation, and now it was time for that conversation to grow, to reach every corner of the world. As the press conference ended, Malik felt the weight of what was to come settle in. The world had heard them. But it wasn't just about getting attention. It was about what came next. Malik knew the next steps would be difficult. There would be pushback, more attempts to downplay the situation, more promises that wouldn't go far enough. But he wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. Isaiah was still processing what had just happened, but Malik could see the shift in him. He had stood in front of the world and spoken his truth, and now the truth had a voice. "You did great, son," Malik said, his voice full of pride. Isaiah turned to look at him, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Thanks, Dad, but we're not done yet, right?" Malik nodded, his eyes fixed ahead. "Not even close." The day after the press conference, the air around Malik and Isaiah was charged with a mixture of anticipation and unease. The world was watching now, and Malik knew that the battle was only just beginning. The media coverage was relentless, with news outlets picking up the story and expanding it. Social media flooded with support for Isaiah, with countless people sharing their own stories of similar discrimination and injustice. But the overwhelming support was tempered by something else. The quiet resistance that always comes with the challenge of dismantling long-standing systems. The flight attendant, Kevin Brooks, had been suspended pending investigation, and Bright Ray Airlines had promised to take immediate action. But Malik wasn't fooled. He knew that the company would likely try to weather the storm, issue a few public statements, and then move on. The real fight wasn't going to be won in the court of public opinion. It was going to be won in the boardrooms, in the policy meetings, and in the institutions that allowed racial profiling and unjust treatment to persist unchecked. Malik sat in the hotel room, phone in hand, staring at the dozens of messages he had received from politicians, activists and lawyers all offering their support. It was overwhelming, but Malik didn't have time for pleasantries. He had one goal: to make sure this wasn't a one-off incident. To make sure that this moment was a turning point in the fight for justice. "Do you want to go for a walk?" Malik asked, looking over at Isaiah, who had been staring out the window for the past few minutes, lost in thought. The boy was no longer the same child who had boarded the plane only a few days ago. Something had changed in him. Something had shifted. He had stepped into the role of someone who would fight for the truth, for justice, no matter how uncomfortable it made the world around him. Isaiah nodded, his expression thoughtful, though there was still a lingering uncertainty in his eyes. "Yeah, I think that's a good idea." Malik stood up and the two of them left the room together. The quiet hum of the city outside was a stark contrast to the intensity of their days. The streets were busy with the usual hustle and bustle, but Malik couldn't shake the feeling that the world was just beginning to notice. They weren't the only ones fighting against injustice anymore. The fight had become larger, had become about so much more than just one boy on a plane. It was about every child, every person who had ever been silenced or treated like they didn't matter. As they walked, Malik couldn't help but notice how people looked at Isaiah. There was respect now, recognition. It wasn't the kind of respect that came from his status as a victim. It was the respect earned from his courage, from his willingness to speak out when everyone else was too afraid. People saw that now. They saw the strength in his eyes. "So," Malik began, breaking the silence, "you ready for the next step?" Isaiah glanced up at him, his eyes narrowing slightly in thought. "What do you mean?" "We've got the world's attention now. But that doesn't mean it's over. Not by a long shot. We're going to push for more change. Not just for you, but for every other kid who might find themselves in your shoes." Isaiah took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling with a quiet intensity. "I think I'm ready," he said finally. "I know this won't be easy, but it's the right thing to do." Malik smiled, his heart swelling with pride. His son had found his voice, had found his place in this fight, and he was ready to stand shoulder to shoulder with him in whatever came next. Back in their hotel room later that evening, Malik sat at the small desk, reviewing a document from his legal team. The investigation into Bright Ray Airlines had already begun, but Malik wasn't about to wait for bureaucratic processes to unfold. He knew that real change wouldn't happen unless they pushed the issue into the open. His phone buzzed again, and this time with a message from Devin Ward. "The higher-ups are starting to sweat. They're looking to settle, but it's not enough. We need a public commitment from Bright Ray to change their policies on racial profiling and unaccompanied minors." Malik typed back quickly, "Agreed. Push them harder. This has to be about policy reform, not just about one employee." Devin's response came almost immediately. "Already on it. We've got some good momentum, but we need to act fast." Malik sat back, exhaling slowly as he looked out the window. The lights of the city twinkled below, and for a moment he let his thoughts wander. What would it take to dismantle the kind of institutionalized bias that had allowed this to happen? What kind of world would his son grow up in if people like Kevin Brooks were allowed to remain in positions of power? He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew that Isaiah was a catalyst, a spark that would ignite a larger movement. What had happened on that plane wasn't just about one flight attendant or one airline. It was a reflection of the deeply ingrained prejudices that existed everywhere, and it was up to them to expose it, to make sure that no one else, no other child, would ever have to feel the way Isaiah had felt. The phone buzzed again, and Malik checked the new message. It was from the press secretary of a major civil rights organization. "We're organizing a national rally next week. We want you and Isaiah to speak. It's time to take this beyond social media. We need real action." Malik stared at the message for a long moment, considering the implications. A rally, a public stand that would bring together thousands of voices, all demanding change. He glanced over at Isaiah, who had just walked into the room and was now standing in the doorway watching his father. Malik gave him a nod, silently inviting him into the conversation. "What do you think, son?" Malik asked, his voice calm but serious. "We've got a chance to make this bigger, much bigger. The rally could be a turning point, a way to make sure the world knows that this fight isn't over." Isaiah met his father's gaze, his expression thoughtful. After a few moments, he nodded. "I think we need to do it. We need to make sure everyone hears us. We can't let this just be another news story that fades away." Malik's chest swelled with pride. His son had come a long way in such a short time. They weren't just fighting for justice for one person anymore. They were fighting for an entire system to change. "All right," Malik said, smiling softly. "We're in. Let's make sure they hear us loud and clear." The day of the rally arrived with the kind of energy that could only come from a movement gaining momentum. The streets were packed with people of all ages, races, and backgrounds, all gathered for one purpose: to demand change. Signs bearing the hashtag #Justice for Isaiah filled the crowd, along with chants and voices calling for accountability and racial justice. Malik stood backstage with Isaiah, watching the crowd gather. His son was standing tall, his face set with determination, but there was a quiet nervousness in his eyes. This was a big step, a public stand that would make waves. "You ready?" Malik asked, his voice calm, steady. Isaiah nodded, though the nervousness was still there. "Yeah, let's do this." As they stepped out onto the stage, the crowd erupted in applause. The sheer volume of support was overwhelming. The rally had drawn people from across the country, all rallying behind the cause of justice and equality. And right there, in the midst of it all, were Malik and Isaiah, father and son, standing together, united in their mission. Malik took the microphone first. His voice rang out, clear and strong. "We're here today, not just because of what happened to my son," he began. "We're here because this happens to children, to people every day. It's time for that to stop. It's time to hold those in power accountable, to make sure that no one else, no child, is ever treated the way Isaiah was." The crowd cheered, their voices rising in unison with Malik's. He could feel the energy in the air, the weight of the moment settling on him like a mantle. This was just the beginning. Malik stepped aside and Isaiah took the microphone. The crowd grew quiet as the boy stood at the front of the stage, his hands gripping the edges of the podium. "I'm not a threat," Isaiah said, his voice steady but filled with passion. "I'm just a kid who wanted to visit his cousin. But that doesn't mean I should be treated like I'm dangerous, and it doesn't mean any other kid should be treated that way, either." The crowd erupted into applause once again. The roar of support, a powerful reminder of the change they were fighting for. And in that moment, Malik knew that they had already won. The movement had begun. The fight for justice was no longer just his. It was theirs. The rally was just the beginning of something much larger. It was the catalyst that turned a private injustice into a public call for change. But it was clear that the momentum had only just started to build. The media coverage was relentless. The hashtags continued to trend, and slowly, Bright Ray Airlines began to feel the weight of the scrutiny. Malik and Isaiah spent the following days speaking with legal teams, activists, and media outlets. They had become the face of the fight for racial justice in the airline industry, but their story had resonated far beyond that. As the days passed, the movement began to take on a life of its own, sparking conversations in boardrooms, classrooms, and homes all over the country. Malik had been in enough battles to know that this wasn't going to be easy. Change, real change, was never handed over willingly. The fight for justice, for accountability, was a long road, one that required more than just the fervor of a single moment. It was going to take persistence, strategy, and patience. But what kept him going was the vision of a world where Isaiah, and children like him, didn't have to endure the same humiliations, the same injustices, the same unfounded fears. And then there were the quiet moments where Malik would sit with Isaiah, the weight of everything still hanging between them, but softened by the bond they shared. They didn't talk about the fight every day. Sometimes they just existed together in the stillness, finding peace in the small things, laughter, shared meals, the comfort of simply being in each other's presence. But there was always that underlying sense of urgency. Malik knew the stakes were high. This wasn't just about a single flight attendant or a single airline. It was about dismantling a system that allowed racial profiling to flourish unchecked. and it was about ensuring that Isaiah, his son, wouldn't have to grow up in a world where his worth was constantly questioned. It was nearly a week after the rally when Malik got the call. The phone buzzed in his pocket, and when he picked it up, Devon's voice was on the other end, urgent yet calm. "Malik, we've got it," Devon said, his voice steady but filled with triumph. Bright Ray Airlines has agreed to full policy reform. They're implementing new procedures for how unaccompanied minors are treated, especially children of color. They're also going to publicly commit to anti-racism training for all flight staff. Malik felt a mixture of relief and disbelief. He had known that this day could come, but now that it was here, it felt almost surreal. They had pushed, they had fought, and now the first real step toward accountability had been taken. "Are you serious?" Malik asked, his voice low, the weight of the moment sinking in. "Absolutely," Devon replied. "They're not getting off easy either. We're setting up an advisory board for transparency. They have to show real, lasting change, or we'll keep this in the public eye. We're not backing down." Malik's chest tightened with pride. "I want to see the details. I need to know everything they're committing to." Devon chuckled lightly. "You'll get them. We're not leaving anything to chance. But this is a major win, Malik. You and Isaiah did this." Malik glanced over at Isaiah, who was sitting on the couch across the room, playing with his phone. The boy looked up at him, sensing something had changed. "I think we did it, son," Malik said, his voice thick with emotion. Isaiah blinked and then smiled, his expression still a little reserved but filled with a quiet sense of accomplishment. "It's not over, right?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with the wisdom of someone who knew better than to believe that one victory would be the end. "No," Malik agreed. "It's not over. This is just the beginning. But it's a damn good start." The victory with Bright Ray Airlines was significant, but Malik knew that the fight couldn't end with a single company. This wasn't just about holding one airline accountable. It was about creating lasting systemic change across the entire industry, and even beyond it. There were deeper issues at play, cultural biases and systems of power that needed to be addressed head-on. With the public momentum behind them, Malik and his team began to push for broader legislative action. They were already in talks with several key figures in Washington who were sympathetic to their cause. The call for a nationwide standard for the treatment of unaccompanied minors, especially minors of color, began to take shape in the form of proposed legislation, the Isaiah Reform Act. Isaiah, once a victim of profiling and systemic injustice, was now being heralded as the face of this new movement. It wasn't just about his personal story anymore. It was about creating a model for how to protect children like him from being unjustly targeted, regardless of their background, race, or appearance. Malik spent countless hours in meetings, phone calls, and strategizing sessions, but it was the moments when he and Isaiah were alone, just the two of them, that kept him grounded. They were in this together, father and son. The weight of the fight was not just Malik's to carry. Isaiah was in this with him, standing side by side, ready to take the next step toward justice. Months passed, and the momentum continued to build. The proposed Isaiah Reform Act had gathered significant support in Congress, and Malik was now preparing to speak at a Senate hearing about the need for national policy reform in the airline industry. Isaiah stood beside his father as they prepared for the hearing, the pressure mounting with every passing minute. The public spotlight, the cameras, the anticipation, it all felt heavier than it had at the rally, more serious, more permanent. "You nervous?" Malik asked, looking down at his son, who was adjusting the collar of his jacket. Isaiah shook his head, though his eyes were focused, determined. "I'm ready. Let's do this." Malik smiled at his son, a brief but proud smile. "You've got this." They walked into the hearing room, and the sight of the Senate committee with its rows of lawmakers and staff didn't faze Malik. This was where they needed to be. This was the next step in their journey. Malik took a deep breath as he stood before the committee, the microphones before him and the eyes of the nation upon him. "I'm here today," he began, "because my son and I were forced to experience something that no child should ever have to experience: racial profiling and mistreatment. And it wasn't just one person. It wasn't just one moment. This is a system that targets children, that fails to see them for who they are, and instead sees them as a threat. The room was silent as Malik spoke, his words cutting through the tension. What happened to Isaiah is happening to countless others every single day. It's time we change that. It's time we make sure no child is ever treated like a criminal before they even have a chance to speak. As Malik finished, the room erupted into applause. His words had struck a chord with those in the room, but more importantly, they had struck a chord with the nation. This was no longer just about one incident. This was a movement that would ensure no child, no person would ever have to face this kind of injustice again. Isaiah stood beside his father, his heart pounding, but his eyes bright with purpose. He knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning, and together they were going to change the world. As Malik and Isaiah left the Senate hearing, the weight of what had just happened began to settle in. The applause, the nods of approval, the speeches from senators pledging their support, all of it felt surreal, as if they were living in someone else's story. But Malik knew better. He knew that nothing had been handed to them. This victory had been earned. Through countless sleepless nights, endless meetings, and most importantly, through Isaiah's bravery in standing up to a world that wanted to silence him. The world was watching, but so were the people in power. The Senate hearing wasn't just a formality. It had been the catalyst for something larger. The Isaiah Reform Act was starting to take shape in the legislative world, gaining support not only from politicians but from everyday people who had experienced the same kind of injustice that Isaiah had. The public outcry following the hearing was deafening. News outlets, social media platforms, and advocacy groups had all rallied around the cause, demanding real reform. This wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was the beginning of a movement that was changing the way the world viewed race, profiling, and accountability in the airline industry. But Malik knew that even with the public backing, the true fight was still ahead of them. The corporate powers, the ones who had let systems of bias fester in their organizations, would not give up without a fight. Bright Ray Airlines had already begun to push back against the reform efforts, trying to downplay the scope of the changes they were willing to make. Malik and his team were prepared for this resistance, though. They knew that real change didn't come from the easy path. It came from pushing, from demanding, and from refusing to settle for anything less than what was right. Back at the hotel, the night after the hearing, Malik sat at his desk, staring at the screen of his laptop, scrolling through the latest updates. The headlines had been encouraging, but he could feel the quiet tension building behind the scenes. The resistance from the airline industry was real, and Bright Ray wasn't going to let go of their policies without a fight. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Isaiah, holding his phone in his hand, looking a little more relaxed than he had in days. "Dad," he said, his voice a bit more at ease than usual. "I was just thinking, maybe it's time we do something a little different. You know, bring this fight to the people who can really make it happen." Malik raised an eyebrow, intrigued by his son's suggestion. "What do you mean?" Isaiah walked into the room, sitting down across from him. "I think it's time we go straight to the people. To the ones who fly. The ones who don't always have the power, but have the voice. If we can get the passengers on our side, if we can get people to speak up about their own experiences, we can force Bright Ray to listen. And we won't just be talking about racial profiling. We'll be talking about human dignity." Malik's heart swelled with pride. His son was more than just a survivor of a single incident. He was a leader, a change-maker, and it wasn't just about the fight for justice for him anymore. It was about empowering others to take part in it. "You're right, son," Malik said, his voice steady. "It's time we take this fight to the people who matter most, the ones who will stand beside us. We're not just fighting an airline. We're fighting for a future where this doesn't happen to anyone else. We can't do it alone." Malik stood up, pacing for a moment as the pieces started falling into place. "It's time to bring the Isaiah Reform Act to the people. Let's organize a national campaign, train people, get them talking, get them sharing their stories. We're going to create a movement that's impossible to ignore." Over the next few weeks, Malik and Isaiah, along with their growing team of activists and allies, launched the Shawishak Voices for Change campaign. The focus wasn't just on pushing for legal reform. It was about creating a groundswell of support among the public. They called on passengers who had experienced racial profiling, those who had been unfairly treated, and anyone who had witnessed injustice in the travel system to come forward and share their stories. They created videos, social media campaigns, and hosted forums where people could speak out. The hashtag #VoicesForChange went viral as stories poured in from all corners of the country. People shared their experiences of being discriminated against because of their race, their appearance, or their status as unaccompanied minors. It wasn't just children. It wasn't just young black kids or children of color. It was people who had been wronged by a system that assumed guilt instead of giving people the benefit of the doubt. The campaign picked up steam quickly. Communities rallied together, organizing local events, town halls, and petition drives. What Malik and Isaiah had started as one family's fight for justice had turned into a movement that wasn't going to let go until real change was achieved. And then the breakthrough came. Bright Ray Airlines, under increasing pressure from the public, agreed to meet with Malik's legal team and representatives from the Voices for Change campaign. They had no choice but to acknowledge the overwhelming response from the public. The airline had no way to deny that racial profiling was rampant, and that their current policies were not only unjust but harmful to their customers and their brand. Malik sat across from the Bright Ray Airlines executives, their faces tense with the realization that the world was watching. They had underestimated the power of the public's voice. They had underestimated the strength of a child's voice. Now, there was no turning back. "We're not here to negotiate for a few token changes," Malik said firmly, looking each executive in the eye. "We're here because this is a matter of justice. We're here because you've allowed systems of bias to flourish unchecked for too long. And that's going to change today." The CEO of Bright Ray Airlines shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Malik didn't flinch. He had come too far, and too many people had put their trust in him to back down now. "Bright Ray is willing to make changes," the CEO said, his voice stiff but trying to sound conciliatory. "We understand that the public sentiment has shifted. We're willing to work with you on the reforms you've proposed. We'll implement new anti-racism training, better screening for unaccompanied minors, and a public apology for the incident involving your son." Malik leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "And that's not enough. Not even close. We need a full overhaul. We need transparency. We need audits. We need a clear, actionable policy that every single employee will be held accountable for. This isn't just about making a few changes to avoid further backlash. This is about making sure this never happens to anyone again." The CEO faltered for a moment, the pressure mounting. Malik knew they were close. They were realizing that the tide had turned. This wasn't a fight they could win with lip service alone. It wasn't just about damage control anymore. It was about repairing trust with a public that had seen too many promises go unfulfilled. "I'm not walking away from this table unless we have full commitment," Malik added. "And it's not just about your company. This is about setting a precedent for every other airline, for every other institution that thinks it can treat people like this and get away with it." The room was silent for a long moment. Finally, the CEO nodded, though his face was tight with frustration. "We'll agree to the full policy changes you're requesting. But you'll need to work with us on the specifics. We need to make this right, not just for you, but for everyone." Malik sat back, exhaling slowly. They had done it. Not only had they secured the commitments they needed from Bright Ray Airlines, but they had also set a precedent for every other company to follow. When the press release came in, it was more than just a win for Malik and Isaiah. It was a victory for every passenger who had been unfairly treated, for every person who had been discriminated against without cause. Bright Ray Airlines had committed to the full overhaul of their policies, including mandatory anti-racism training, a transparent reporting system for complaints, and the establishment of a new team dedicated to ensuring fair treatment of all passengers, especially minors. The Isaiah Reform Act gained unprecedented traction, with other airlines and institutions following suit. Malik knew the battle was far from over. This was a systemic problem, one that reached far beyond one airline or one policy. But today, they had won a crucial victory, a victory that would reverberate through the industry for years to come. As Malik stood with Isaiah on the steps of their hotel, looking out at the city below, he felt a quiet sense of peace wash over him. This fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But they had done something that mattered. They had made the world listen. "I'm proud of you, son," Malik said, his voice thick with emotion. Isaiah looked up at him, his eyes steady, his face full of determination. "We did it together, Dad," Malik smiled, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "And we're just getting started."